How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're starting Daf Yud, Daf 10 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 10 is great. There are two big sections, but particularly the first section has kind of subparts. But the theme is when the knife is found to be nicked. Very interesting question. So you slaughter the animal, and then at some later point in the day, you look at the knife and you say, wait a second, there's a nick in this knife. So the question is, what becomes of the animal? Can we assume that the shechita was kosher, or must we assume that the shechita was not kosher because the knife was nicked? That is going to be a very interesting discussion, as I said, with different subsections to it. That is the first kind of big part of Daf Yud of Masechta Chullin. And the second part is the source for relying on a chazakah. Very interesting. Of course, we have this concept in halacha, where this is not the first time we've seen it, but uki milsa achazake, that we keep something on its, that we attribute, that we assign to something the status that it had initially, its initial status based on its chazakah, based on the assumption that it has and it will continue to have a particular status. Where is that from? Friends, this is what we have to look forward to on Daf Yud of Masechta Chullin. Come, join me. Let's do this together. Let's enjoy ourselves and have a great time on Daf Yud of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin Daf Yud Amid Aleph at the two dots, about 10 or 15 lines into Daf Yud Amid Aleph. First word on the line is itmar, hashochit besakin. So a person slaughters an animal with a knife, v'nimtzeis piguma, and then it turns out that the knife has a nick in it. It is a posel knife. Amar Rafuna says, Rafuna afilu shiber ba atzomis kol hayom psulach hashinan shema beor nifgima. Let's maybe keep reading. Rav Chizda Amar Ksheira. You could switch the word Shema to Amor. Amor be'etzim nifgima. V'sham Rafuna kishmaite. Rav Chizda my taima. I'm going to keep on reading and then we're going to get into this again. Amar lach etzim v'alei pogem or safek pogem safek lo pogem and v'safek v'vadai v'safek motzim midei vadai. Oh, okay. So yesterday, so what are we talking about? So you have a person and he shechts a sheep, okay? I'm using a sheep as an example. And he shechts a sheep. Great. And everything went well. Let's assume he also checked the simanim afterwards. Everything was great. And then he goes on with his day. And a few hours later, he has a look at his knife. And the knife has nicks in it. And he says, wait a second. This is the first time I'm looking at the knife since the shechita. If there are nicks in this knife, maybe there were nicks in the knife at the time of the shechita, which means that the shechita is posel. However, here's the thing. From the time of the shechita until now, over the past few hours, he's been chopping bones. And let me tell you something. I don't know if I've ever chopped bones I definitely haven't chopped bones with shechita knives, but apparently it is certain to nick the bone. That's for sure. To nick the knife. That's for sure. If you're going to take a shechita knife, you're going to be chopping up bones with it, you can assume that by the end of your chopping, your knife will have nicks in the knife. So, for sure, the bones nick the knife. The thing is, that doesn't mean that the knife was necessarily kosher at the time of the shechita. It could be that at the time of the shechita, the knife was already nicked, and the bone chopping just further nicked. But the fact that you were chopping bones that definitely nicked the knife does not mean that the knife was kosher at the time of the shechita. It could have already been nicked at the time of the shechita. For example, so the assumption is that you checked the knife before the shechita, okay, to make sure that before the shechita the knife was kosher. But what could have happened is, as the knife was slicing through the neck, as the knife was slicing through the skin, in order to get to the pipes, in order to get to the trachea and the esophagus, maybe as the knife was slicing through the skin, the knife got nicked. which means that by the time the knife was now cutting through the trachea and the esophagus, it was already nicked and it was already pasul. So that is the concern. So even though we know for sure that the chopping of the bones nicked the knife, there's no question about that, but the slicing through the skin of the neck may, probably not, but there is a slight possibility that it could have nicked the knife, and we're simply not, there's no way of us knowing since we didn't check the knife immediately after the shechita. We're only having a look at it later on. So now, we saw the shita of Rav Huna yesterday, who says, well, we're just going to keep everything on its chazakah. That when the sheep was alive, it's osur. Can't eat a live animal. It's Eivim min achai. It only becomes mutter once there's a proper shechita, once there's a verified kosher shechita. We haven't verified that this is a kosher shechita. We know that the animal was osur. We haven't validated that all good with the shechita because we haven't checked the knife. All of a sudden, when we do check the knife, we're saying, wait a second, I don't actually know that this knife was kosher at the time of the shechita. So according to Rav Huna, this animal was never released from its osur status, and it remains osur. Let me chop a shluck of tea. Now, Rav Chisda says something very interesting, however, which is he says that the sheep is kosher. Why is it kosher? Well, because, what would be the reason to say that it's not kosher, that it's pasul? Well, because the knife that you used was nicked. Well, let's take a look at this knife for a second. We know that this knife was used after the shechita for chopping up bones, and we know for sure that chopping up bones is going to nick the knife. There is a slight possibility that maybe when the knife was cutting through the neck, that cutting through the hide, the skin may have nicked the knife. Yeah, it could be. But I'll tell you something, I know for sure that the bones nicked the knife. That's for sure. Maybe the skin did too, but the bones for sure did. So if we're looking at this knife and we're saying we know for sure it was nicked by the bones, maybe it was nicked by the neck, we're going to say that what nicked this knife, we're going to go with the 100%. We're going to go with the for sure, and we're going to say that it was the bones that nicked the knife, right? If we're looking at this knife, we're saying what was the source of the nick? It was the bones. We're not going to, if it's between the bones and the neck, ein safek motzi midei vadei. There's a suffix that maybe the skin nicked the knife, but it's 100% sure that the bones for sure nicked the knife. So we are going to assume that it's the bones that nicked the knife, and therefore at the time of the shechita, we're going to say that the knife was kosher, and therefore the animal is kosher. Let us read that inside. So again, Idmar was stated, Ashoichet b'sakin. So if one slaughters a animal with a knife, v'nimtza is piguma, and later on you find that, wait a second, this knife is nicked. Rav Huna says, Rav Huna, afilu shiber ba'atzomus kol hayom. Says Rav Huna, even if he was chopping up bones all day, and you could say for sure it was the chopping of the bones that nicked the knife, nonetheless, psula, the sheep remains pasul, nevela, chashinon, shema, be'or nifkema, out of concern that, well, there is the possibility that the knife got nicked while cutting through the skin of the neck. Rav Chisda Amar Kshera, whereas Rav Chisda says that the sheep is kosher, you could change Shema to Amor. Amor be'etzem nifkima. I will say, look, what nicked the knife? The bones. The skin did not nick the knife. So I understand Rav Huna's shita, because Rav Huna says, like he said yesterday, that there's a chazakah that this animal is osur, and it remains so until we know for sure that it's mutter. We don't know for sure that it's mutter, therefore it remains osur. Don't change the status. El Rav Chisda, my timer, but Rav Chisda, why does he say that the animal? Why does he say that the sheep is kosher? Amalach Rav Chisda will say to you, etzem vaday pogem or suffik pogem. Well, the question is if this knife is kosher or not. Was the knife kosher at the time of the shechita? Well, we're looking at this knife and we're saying it for sure got nicked from the bones, right? Etzem vade pogim. The bones are for sure going to nick the knife. Or safek pogim. Safek eno lo pogim. In terms of the skin, maybe it nicked the knife, maybe it didn't. Okay, well, choosing between the two, what nicked the knife, have a safek vivadai. So you have a safek from the skin, a vadai from the bones, vein safek motzi midei vadai. The safek, the maybe yes, maybe no, is not going to override the for sure, and therefore we're going to go with the for sure, which is that the bones nicked the knife, and we are going to say at the time of the shechita, the knife was kosher, and the knife got nicked later on, and therefore the sheep is kosher. Fine. Givaldik. Smachlek is Rav Huna and Rav Chizda about if the sheep is kosher when the knife turns out to be nicked later on. Mosiv Rava, the Sayur the Rav Huna. So Rava asked an interesting question in support of Rav Huna against Rav Chizda. Tava v'alav v'nimtza alav davar chotzetz. Afapi shenis asik boso amin kodem kulo lo asalo tvila at yom barili shel haya alai kodem lachin. Okay. Rava says, look, we have a scenario where you have a person goes to the mikveh. You have a person, he was tummy. So he went to the mikveh in order to become tahor. Okay, great. Now, after going to the mikveh, he goes, and let's say he's painting. For the next few hours, he's busy painting. And then later on, he looks at his body, he says, wait, I paint on my body. So wait, when I went to the mikveh, was there paint on my body when I went to the mikveh? If when I went to the mikveh there was paint on my body, that would have been a chatzitza, and I would still be tummy. But then again, I had been painting all day since then, so it most likely the paint is coming from the fact that I've been working with paint all day. But nonetheless, we say that he's tummy. So what do we know in this case? In this case, he was for sure tummy. We also know that he for sure went to the mikveh, jumped into the mikveh. Maybe the paint that he discovered on his body later on was on his body at the time that he went to the mikveh. Maybe it wasn't. We don't know. And yet we're saying that he remains tummy because the suffix of maybe the paint was on his body at the time that he went to the mikveh is going to override the vada that he went to the mikveh. We know he for sure jumped in a kosher mikveh. Maybe he had paint on his body at the time that it's a chatzitza and therefore the tefillah doesn't count. And we're saying, yeah, because of that suffix, we're going to be motzi midei vadai that he went to the mikveh. For sure he jumped in a kosher mikveh, but we don't care because maybe there was paint on his body at the time that he went to the mikveh. So Rava argues against Rav Chizda because Rav Chizda had said that, well, we're going to look at this knife and saying, for sure, the bones would have nicked the knife. Possibly the knife got nicked while slicing through the skin of the neck. Rav Chizda says, we're going to go based on the vadei. Ain safek motzi midei vadei. Rava says, I'll bring you an example of safek motzi midei vadei. The possibility that maybe there was paint on his body at the time that he went to the mikveh is overriding the fact that for sure he jumped in a kosher mikveh. That's Rava's kasha. So again, Mosiv Rava as a kasha and Rav Chizda, the Sayur Rav Huna to support Rav Huna. 1 second, tea. Taval v'olah, that a person jumps in a mikveh, for sure he was tameh, he for sure went into the mikveh. And then later on he finds something that would have been a chatzitza, something that would have been a impediment between his body and the mikveh water. As an example, I used paint. Even though he was painting all day post mikveh, nonetheless, lo asalo tefillah. The dipping in the mikveh is not going to work. It's going to be ineffective. We have to assume he's tamei. Unless he could say, I know for sure that at the time I went to the mikveh, this paint was not on me. But short of that, we're gonna say, look, we have to be concerned that maybe there was paint on your body at the time you went to the mikveh, and therefore it's not kosher. So in this case of the mikveh, divadai tovel, he for sure jumped in a mikveh. Safek ava ole, safek lo ava ole. Maybe at the time that he jumped into the mikveh, there was paint on his body. Maybe there wasn't. We don't know. It's a safek. It's uncertain. The kasi safek amosmi devadai, and the safek of maybe there was paint on his body is overriding the fact that he for sure jumped in a kosher mikveh. And for the Gemara, shiny awesome. Okay, so now, by the way, we're going to go back and forth a little bit until we resolve at our very interesting answer. Shiny awesome, it is different when it comes to the mikvah, the ikad lemeimar hamitame al chizkaso ve'emelo tavo. Okay, by the mikvah, we're going to go back and forth. You might think, wait a second, wouldn't we say the same thing by the sheep? You'll see. We're going to go back and forth a little bit for the next few lines. So the Gemara says, well, by the mikvah, we know that the person was tameh beforehand. We know that the person was tameh beforehand. And therefore, again, we could say, he was tameh beforehand. And now we're uncertain. Yeah, he jumped into the mikvah, but maybe he had paint on his body at the time. So we say, well, let's just leave him at his current status quo that he is tameh. Okay, but achinami, let's say the same thing by the animal. Let's say the same thing by the sheep then. The sheep, when it was alive, is aser. It only becomes mutter when there's proper shechita. I could argue that the knife may have been nicked at the time of the shechita. So let's say, you know what? Let's just keep the status quo and say that the animal is aser. Why is Rav Chisda saying it's mutter? So one says, well, what do you mean? I mean, you could see it. The animal is sechted. Here's a slaughtered animal in front of us. Okay, but say the same thing by the mikveh. He went into the mikveh. Like, say he's tahor. So isilida be'reyese. Yeah, but by the mikveh, there is some reason to say that it should be ineffective, i.e., he found some paint on his body. But here also, we found the nick in the knife. We could say that the shechita was possible. So listen to what the Gemara answers. It's a great answer. Very interesting answer. Sakin is ra'oi, be'emlo is ra'oi. Here is the difference. Ready for the difference, friends? The difference is when it comes to shechita, the reason why Rav Chisda says that the shechita is kshera, and we say that the knife was kosher at the time of the shechita, is because the safek is with regard to the knife. It's not with regard to the animal. The animal that we're talking about, is this animal kosher or not? The animal is completely fine. The question regards a Facebook meta element here, which is the knife that was used to slaughter this animal. So when it comes to the knife, well, we know for sure it would have gotten nicked by the bones. Maybe it got nicked by the skin. We're going to go with so we're saying ein safek motzim devade. While looking at the knife and analyzing the knife, we could say, you know what? The animal itself is completely fine. We're just discussing this tool, this kli, this tool, this kind of Facebook meta element that was used within the context of the shechita, i.e. the knife that was used for the shechita, but the animal itself is fine. In terms of this knife, was it kosher at the time or not? Well, let's go based on the vadai and say it was kosher. That for sure the nick happened afterwards. But when it comes to the mikvah, on the other hand, the question is about the person himself. Again, if we go back to the animal for a second, what's ultimately the question? Is this animal kosher? And the animal itself is completely fine. The question was about the knife. When it comes to the person, what's the question? Is this person tahor? And the suffix that we have is about him himself. Was he himself in a state to go to the mikvah when he jumped into the mikvah? Did he himself have paint on his body at the time they went to the mikvah? The question that we have is about him himself. The main object, if you will, of our scrutiny, in this case, the person, Is he tahor? Is he tameh? Well, he himself is the one who has the question about him. Was he himself, would he have paint on him at the time he went to the mikveh or not? As opposed to the animal, the question revolves around not the animal itself, but the knife which was used in the slaughtering of the animal. So in that case, when it's about the knife, when it's not about the animal itself that we're trying to figure out if the animal is kosher, but it's about the knife, and we say, well, we have suffix and vadai, we can go with the vadai. But when the question arises about the object itself that we're trying to figure out if it's kosher or not, or in this case, if it's tameh or not, we're going to say, well, since the question is arising about him himself, we're going to say that the tefillah is not going to work. Very interesting answer over there. Now, Meisvei, we have a question against Rav Chizde. Shochat es haveshet ve'achar kach shochat es hagargeres. No, what? Meisvei, Rav contradiction. Shochat es haveshet ve'achar kach nishmito hagargeres kshera. Very, very, very interesting question over here. So this is talking about the shechita of a bird. Now, as I think it's the first Mishnah in the next parak, or the second Mishnah in the next parak. Let's see. Where's the next parak? Where did the next parak start? Let's see. Sheni, Rishon, Sheni. Here. Hashochet echad ba'of. There it goes. Mamish, the beginning of the second parak. Hashochet echad ba'of. Vishnayim bebeima. Shchitas uksher. Perfect. Exactly what I'm looking for. Now, the first Mishnah in the second parak of Masechta Chullin says that when it comes to a bird, all technically for the shechita of a bird to be kshera, you need to slice through just one of the two simanim. You have the trachea, you have the esophagus. Slicing through just one of the simanim is a kosher shechita when it comes to a bird. Okay. So we're saying, right, meizvei shachat es aveshet. So if he sliced through the esophagus, ve'achar kach nishmito agargeres, and then afterwards, the trachea was pulled out of where it's connected to the head, essentially. And then so you sliced through the esophagus, and then the trachea was pulled out of its connection to the head. Kshera. That's fine, because at the time that the trachea got pulled out from its place, from its connection, the animal was already shechted because the esophagus was sliced through at the time. Nishmita hagargeres ve'achar kach shochat es haveshet psula. However, if the trachea was yanked from its connection to the head, if the trachea was pulled out from its connection to the head, and only then you sliced through the esophagus, so the bird is psula, it's an nevela. The bird is going to be an nevela in that case, because at the time that you sliced through the esophagus, the trachea was already pulled out from its connection to the head. Now, right from where it's connected to the head. Now, there's an interesting shaila of why that is. So for now, let's just say that, well, when you yank the trachea, the windpipe, from its connection to the head, it makes the bird a treifa, which means that therefore, at the time that you then go ahead and slice through the esophagus, you are slaughtering a treifa, and therefore it is a nevela. Okay, so again, if you slice through the esophagus and then the trachea is disconnected from the head, it's kosher. If the trachea is disconnected from the head and then you slice through the esophagus, it's a nevela. Shachat es haveshet. What if you're not sure? What if you slice through the esophagus v'nimtzeis and now you realize, wait a second, hagargeres shmuta. The trachea has been disconnected from its connection to the head. The eino yodea im kodem shchita nishmito, and he doesn't know, was the trachea disconnected before the shchita, in which case it's a partial shchita, im la'achar shchita, or was it disconnected after the shchita, in which case it's a kosher shchita. Nishmita, it was disconnected. Ze'aya maise, this once happened, Varmu, and they said, Kol suffix b'shchita pasul. That any suffix when it comes to shchita is pasul, and therefore, if we're not sure if the trachea was disconnected before the shchita or after the shchita, we don't know, so we have to assume that it was disconnected before the shchita and that it is a pasul shchita. Okay, fine. Now, frag the Gemara, kol suffix b'shchita l'asuyimai. When it says, when that brisa says, kol suffix b'shchita is pasul, what's that coming to include? Right? All suffix b'shchita are pasul. What's that coming to include? All. Malav the isuye kai gavna. Is it not coming to include our scenario of you slaughter a sheep and then later on in the day you see, whoa, the knife is nicked. Was it nicked at the time of the shchita? And you were chopping bones all day. When it says kol suffix b'shchita pasul, is that not coming to say that even in this case we have to assume that the knife was nicked at the time of the shchita and that the shchita is psula, like Rav Huna, not like Rav Chizda? Lo, lasuye suffix shah suffix daras. No. It's coming to include if you're not sure if you pause in the middle for long enough to be pasul. You're not sure if you press down on the shchita. So we're saying in those cases the shchita is psula, but in the case of the nicked knife, Rav Chizda would argue that it's ksher. Umayshna, what's the difference? Hasam is silida bareisa bebehema hacha sakin isra'oi behema lo isra'oi. Like we answered earlier, that when it comes to shahiyah, when it comes to drasa, the question is about whether or not the animal itself was slaughtered. What was the shchita itself a kosher shchita? Did you press down? Did you pause in the middle? It's about the slaughtering of the animal itself, and there we'll say that a suffix is any suffix is possible. When it comes to the knife that was used, we could argue that we would say, like Rav Chizda says, that it for sure got nicked when you were chopping the bones, and we're going to assume that and say that the knife was kosher at the time of the shchita and that the animal is kosher. So friends, now that we mention this concept of the trachea being pulled out of its place where it was connected to the neck, I do want to mention an important tosfos from yesterday's daf test that I didn't get to. I only saw it. So I recorded daf test on Friday. It's now Sunday morning. And on Shabbos, I noticed that I noticed that this was an important tosfos on daf test, and that I hadn't learned it on daf test. I was rushing before Shabbos. There's a very important tosfos there about ikur that I want to highlight. I think if we're learning, this is like an important tosfos for us to know if we're learning Hilchos Shchita. So I do want to point it out now, and it's related to the sugya that we just learned about the trachea or even the esophagus being disconnected from where it's connected to the head. Now, we had learned on Friday, and we have learned in the past, that there are 5 psuls when it comes to Shchita. One of them is called ikur. Now, I've been explaining ikur as meaning, so ikur is tearing, as meaning that if the knife is nicked and you slaughter and you're slicing through the trachea and the esophagus, if the knife is nicked, it's going to tear the simanim as you are slicing through them. That is how Rashi understands ikur as explained by Tosfos. Tosfos, however, also mentions the opinion of the Halachas Gedolis, and also the Rambam is similar, that they explain that ikur, one of these 5 psuls of shchita, is not when the knife is nicked and you're slicing through and it's going to tear the esophagus. No. It's what we just described. That ikur is when, so according to Halachas Gedolis, quoted it in Tosfos, ikur is when the trachea or the esophagus gets disconnected from the head before the shchita and then you're slicing through the simanim that have already been disconnected. That is ikor according to halachas gedolos. When the trachea and the esophagus or the esophagus or both get disconnected from the head, and then you slice through them, that is ikor. Now, you might be wondering, wait a second. We just explained, didn't we just say that if the trachea was disconnected from the head before you slice through the esophagus and the bird, the shechita is psula and it's nevela because the bird was already a treifa at the time that you slice through the esophagus if the trachea had already been disconnected. So, therefore, the shaila is according to halachas gedolis that he's saying that ikor is that the trachea or the esophagus has been disconnected before the shechita. Well, wouldn't you just be shechting a treifa? So according to halachas gedolis, he would say that disconnecting the trachea or the esophagus does not make it a treifa, and it's simply a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that you're not allowed to slaughter if the trachea or esophagus has been disconnected from that, even though it's not a treifa, but it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai that you're not allowed to slaughter in that state, and therefore he would explain that when it comes to the bird that we just explained, so if the trachea has already been disconnected from the head and then you slice through the esophagus, it's possible, not because the bird's a treifa, but because it's simply halacha l'Moshe Sinai that you're not allowed to do that. Okay, that's that. I just thought it was a very important Tosfos. I saw that a bunch of places were quoting this Tosfos from Daf Tes when it comes to ikor and defining what it is. So also I looked at the Rambam yesterday and he was saying that ikor also is really slightly different but related to when the trachea or the esophagus is disconnected from the head. So I thought that it was important for us to know this because ikor is going to be coming up, and it is the opinion of Rashi, as explained by Tosfos, that when the knife has a nick in it and you're slicing through the neck, through the simanim, the nick will tear the simanim. There are other opinions that connect ikor to the trachea and the esophagus being disconnected from their connection to the head. Now, back to the machlokes between Rav Huna, who says that the animal is nevela, and Rav Chizda, who says that the animal is kosher. Returning to our machlokes, Vilchsa da halacha is kavasi de Rav Huna kishalo shiber ba etzem, Vilchsa kavasi de Rav Chizda kisha ba etzem. Mechlal de Rav Chizda avagav de lo shiber ba etzem el b'may ifkim and betzem de mafrekes ifkim. Fine. So the Gemara now says, okay, so we have this machlokes between Rav Huna, who says nevela, Rav Chizda, who says ksher. And says the Gemara, well, I'll give you two scenarios. In one of them, we're going to paskin like Rav Huna over Rav Chizda. And the other scenario, we're going to paskin like Rav Chizda over Rav Huna. And what do we say? Again, Vilchsa da halacha is kavazid Rav Huna b'shalo shiber ba etzem. So if you weren't chopping up bones, and you find that the knife is nicked, so we're going to paskin like Rav Huna to say that the shechita, so you weren't chopping up any bones, you find that the knife is nicked, and now you're like, wait a second, I have a nicked knife. Is the animal kosher? So in this case, we're going to paskin like Rav Huna and say no. The animal's a nevela. We're not going to hold like Rav Chizda to say that it's ksher. Now, let's go weiter. So, Vilchsa kavasi de Rav Huna b'shalo shiber ba'etzem, Vilchsa kavasi de Rav Chizda kisha shiber ba'etzem. And when you were chopping up bones all day, and now the knife is nicked, and we want to know, is this animal ksher? In that case, we're going to pass him like Rav Chizda over Rav Huna to say that the knife was nicked by the bones, and at the time of the shechita, the knife was kosher, and the animal therefore is kosher. So let's do that again. When you weren't chopping up knives when you weren't chopping up bones with the knife, and you find that the knife is nicked, so we're going to say that the animal is nevela. When you were chopping up bones and the knife is nicked, we're going to say like Rav Chizda, that the knife was nicked by the bones, and that at the time of the shechita it was kshira. Now, for an interesting question. So the Gemara asks an interesting question. It says, by the fact that we're saying that when you were not chopping up bones, and still you find that the knife is nicked, so we say we're going to paskin like Rav Huna over Rav Chizda to say that the animal is a nevela, it's not kosher. So what? You're saying that there is actually a machlokas about that? If you slaughter an animal, and then later on you look at the knife and it's nicked, and you were not chopping up bones all day. So we're saying in that case, we're going to paskin like Rav Huna over Rav Chizda, we're going to say that the animal is an nevela, you can't eat it. But I don't understand, Rav Chizda would say in that case that it's kosher, but based on what? You weren't chopping up bones all day. The animal's nicked. Why would Rav Chizda say that the animal's kosher? So Ella b'may ivkim. How would the knife have gotten nicked if he wasn't chopping up bones according to Rav Chizda? Of course, shouldn't Rav Chizda agree that we have to assume that the knife was nicked at the time of the shechita in that case? So it's talking about a situation where when the shochet slaughter is sliced through the pipes, he sliced through the pipes and into the neck bone. So he was not chopping up bones all day. But when he sliced through the neck, he sliced into the neck bone. And in that case, Rav Chizda would say, even though the neck bone nicking the knife is just as likely as the skin nicking the knife, it's just as likely that the knife could have gotten nicked while slicing through the skin as it is that the knife could have gotten nicked when it hit the neck bone after slicing through the simanim. Even so, Rav Chizda says we could be lenient and assume that the knife got nicked when it hit the neck bone, which means that as it was slicing through the trachea and esophagus, it was not yet nicked. Rav Chizda says we could be lenient and say that the animal is kosher, and Rav Huna says no, we're going to say it's nevela, and we're saying that in that case we paskin not like Rav Chizda was lenient, but like Rav Huna. So in a scenario where the shochet sliced through the simanim and then into the neck bone, so if Chizda says it's kosher, we'll assume that the nick happened in the neck bone, but during the slicing through the simanim, it was still kosher. Rav Huna says no, we're going to assume that it's no more likely that the neck bone would have nicked the knife rather than the skin, and therefore Rav Huna says we got to assume that it is a nevela. So we're saying in that case we passing like Rav Huna, but in the case where his mom is chopping up bones all day and the knife is nicked, there we'll passing like Rav Chizda. But uvda, there was this once happened. V'tarif Rav Yosef at Tleiser chayvasa. One time there was a shochet who slaughtered 13 animals with the same knife, and he looks at the knife afterwards and he realizes, the knife is nicked. Did I just slaughter 13 animals with a nicked knife? And he says, V'taraf Rav Yosef at Tleiser chayvasa, and Rav Yosef says that they're all treifas, because we have to assume that the knife was nicked at the time that you slaughtered even the first one. Well, that's the shaila. The shaila is what exactly it means. But we have to assume that the knife was nicked when slaughtering, and therefore the animals are treif. Right? You're tearing through the pipes with the nicked knife. So do we say Kiman? Do we say it's Kirav Huna like Rav Huna? Va'afilu b'kamaisa. So do we say that it's like Rav Huna, and we have to assume that the nick happened while slicing through the skin of the first animal? So as slicing through the skin of the first animal, the knife got nicked, and already the first animal is nevela, is treif. Lo Rav Chizda. No, we want to say it's Rav Chizda v'levar mikamaisa. To the exclusion of the first one. What Rav Chizda would say is that when slicing through the first animal, so it sliced through the skin of the neck just fine, through the trachea and the esophagus just fine, and then when it hit the neck bone, it got nicked. So the first animal is kosher, but all subsequent animals were slaughtered with a nicked knife, and the subsequent 12 animals were treif. If you by saying alternatively, lolam kiravuna, alternatively you could say no. Actually, it makes more sense to say like Ravuna because the ikar of Chizda, if you're going to say like Rav Chizda, mirde misla talinon, if we're going to be lenient, right? If we're going to say like Rav Chizda, and we're going to say that the first animal is kosher because we'll assume that as you slice through the neck, the knife was kosher, and then you sliced through the trachea and the esophagus, the knife was still kosher. It got nicked when you hit the neck bone. So if already we're being lenient to say that it got nicked when it hit the neck bone, why don't we just say that just like that could have happened for the first animal, and we're being lenient, it could have happened for the last animal too, i.e., maybe the knife was kosher for all the animals, including even the most recent one. And it was when you sliced through the most recent animal, the last animal, that then you hit the neck, and only at that point the knife got nicked. But at that point you'd already sliced through the trachea and the esophagus. You could say that all 13 animals, if already we're being lenient to say they got nicked from the neck bone rather than from the skin, let's say they got nicked from the neck bone of the last animal, and that all of the animals are kosher therefore. Tosfos Taka and Daf Yomi Chullin says that you can even make the argument to say that he's going to be more careful for the first 13 animals, knowing that he's got more animals, for the earlier animals, knowing that he has more animals to slaughter. For the final animal, maybe he was less careful, and then he sliced harder and hit the bone, and it got nicked on the last one. So there is reason to explain why, according to Rav Chizda, maybe all the animals should be kosher. The thing is, we know that Rav Yosef said that these animals are treif. So therefore, rather than saying like it's Rav Chizda, let's say that it's like Rav Huna, and to say that, even when slicing through the skin of the first animal, the knife already got nicked, and when slicing through the trachea and the esophagus, it was already nicked, and all of the animals are treifas, are nevelas. So again, lo la'olam, I'll say Rav Huna, like Rav Huna the ikar of Chizda, because if we're going to say like Rav Chizda, mirde misla talinon, if according to Rav Chizda we're already being lenient to say that the nick happened when it hit the neck bone rather than the skin, so how do we know that the nick happened from the neck bone of the first animal? Maybe it got nicked from the neck bone of the most recent animal after the trachea and esophagus had already been sliced through, and that all of the animals are actually kosher. Okay, so we'll say that it is like Rav Chizda, and that all the animals are actually pasul. Says Rav Kahana, matzrich b'dikusa ben kol chada v'chada. Says Rav Acha b'derava to Rav Ashi that Rav Kahana requires checking the knife in between every single animal. Between each animal that you slaughter, check the knife. Kiman, who is that like? Do we say it's Rav Huna v'lemifsol kamaisa? Is it like Rav Huna, and that if you would slaughter the first animal and you would then check the knife and it's nicked, we would already say that that animal is treif, because we have to assume that it got nicked when slicing through the neck, like Rav Huna, and even the first animal would be treif. Lo, Rav Chizda, answers of Ashi, no, I could say that it's like Rav Chizda v'lachshure basraisa. And to say that the reason to check the knife between each animal is because if after the first animal you look at the knife and it's nicked, so you could say like Rav Chizda that it got nicked when slicing through, right after slicing through the neck, when you hit the neck bone, that's when it got nicked, but the animal itself is kosher. And by checking the knife, you salvage all subsequent animals, that would be puzzle because you'd be slaughtering them with a nicked knife. Now, what about the fact that we said that according to Rav Chizda, we can argue that all the animals should be kosher because we'll say that it got nicked by the neck bone of the last animal. So according to this, you'd have to say Rav Ashi is not assuming Rav Chizda in that way. Okay, fine. So therefore, the question is it like Rav Huna that the point of checking the knife after the first one is that if after the first one you check the knife and it's nicked, even the first one is already treif, because we'll assume that it got nicked while slicing through the neck before slicing through the trachea and esophagus, or like Rav Chizda, that no, that animal will be kosher because we'll say it got nicked by the neck bone, but it's to salvage all the subsequent animals, which would be puzzle, because we would assume that you were slicing through their necks with a nicked knife. If that's the case, but if we're saying that you have to check the knife in between every single animal, does that mean that you have to schlep out to the Rav of the city to check the knife? Right? Because we had said the other day that you go to the Rav of the city to have him check the knife before the shechita. So does that mean that after each animal you have to schlep over to the Rav of the city to have a look at the knife? So the Gemara answers, no, you don't, because Eid Echad Nemun B'Yisurin. Because we could trust one witness when it comes to Isser V'Heter. That if the Shaychet says that it's a kosher shechita, we could trust him. The idea, as Rashi points out, the concept of witnesses requiring two Eidim are for Dinei Mominis, as we know all about from Nezikin. Misas Bezdin requires Eidim. Arayis requires Eidim. Like by Sota, for example, you have to have witnesses to testify that she had an affair. But by Isser V'Heter, such as can I eat this meat or not, and if the Shaychet says it was a kosher shechita, we believe him. Well, if that's the case, then why do I need to show the knife bichlal to the chacham, to the Rav of the city, even before the first shechita? At the end of the day, why do I need anybody to check the knife for me? Says Rabbi Yochanan, well, the fact of the matter is, you don't need to check the knife, to have the Rav of the city check the knife to make sure that it's kosher. No, that's not the point. The reason why the Rav of the city is checking the knife, or you bring the knife to the Rav of the city to check the knife before shechita, is not because he's the one making sure that it's kosher, and without him you can't know that it's kosher. No, you can check your own knives. It's an honor thing to give, right? To give cover, to give proper respect to the Rav of the city. Before you start doing shechita, you go to the Rav of the city, present yourself, show him the knife. He has a look. He says, "Wow, okay, great." And then you go and you do your shechita, but it's more of a formality, a way of showing respect and deference to the Rav of the city. But the fact of the matter is, you can just testify about your own knife. We will trust the shaychet when he says that the shechita was kshera, and therefore in between each animal, the shaychet could check his own knife, and that's completely fine. And now we get up to the second section of today's daf. The source for relying upon a chazakah, says the Gemara, Mina milsa damrabanan, from where comes this concept? Uki milsa achazaki. From where, right, when we have this concept of let's keep the status quo of something, that if something has, if you have this person who's tameh and he went into the mikvah and there's some kind of question about if the mikvah was caught, well, he had a chazakah that beforehand he was tameh. We're going to assume that he can, just like he was tameh before, he continues being tameh until we know for sure that he's tahor. This concept of maintaining the status quo, where does that come from? Amr Shmuel ben Achmani Amr Yonason Amar Krav V'yotza Akoyin min Abayis El Pesach Ha'abayis Vizkeres Abayis Shivas Yom. Well, the pasuk says by the tzaras of the house that the kohen goes into the house, he has a look, and he sees, okay, it appears that there is tzaras here. There's a proper shear. There's a proper amount of tzaras over here. And again, it says, V'yotza HaKohen, the Kohen goes out, min habayis, from the house, El Pesach habayis, to the doorway of the house, And then he closes up the house for 7 days. But 1 second, he went into the house, he checked the tzaras, he says, okay, that's a proper shear. He then turns around, leaves the house. How do you know that between the time that he had a look at the tzaras and the time that he stepped outside of the house, maybe the size of the tzaras decreased, it shrunk, and now it was less than a shear? How do you know that when he left the house, it was still a proper shear? Well, because we'll say, let's assume the status quo. If he went into the house, had a look at the tzaras, said it's a proper amount to be tzaras, we're going to assume that when he turns around and he's no longer looking at it, it's still that same size. It was large enough to be tzaras when he looked at it, and we're going to assume that it's still large enough. We maintain that it is still large enough to be tzaras, even after he has turned around and left the house. Rav Yaakov asks an interesting question, and he says, wait, why are we assuming that when he leaves the house, he's not looking at it, and we're just assuming that it's still the same size? Maybe he is looking at it as he leaves the house. He leaves the house backwards. He's walking backwards so that he can keep an eye on the tzaras, so that when he closes up the house, he knows for sure that there is still a shear of tzaras when he closes up the house. He's not making any assumptions. Maybe he backs out backwards so that when he declares that he's closing up the house, he knows 100%. He knows with 100% certainty that there is a proper shear of tzaras because he's looking at it. He's looking at the tzaras. Kinofak, as he's going out. Abai says, no, that's not what's happening. For 2 reasons. Reason number one, when the pasuk says, V'yotza akoin, that the kohen goes out, walking out backwards is not going out, is not considered yitzia. Yitzia derech achorv, walking out, exiting backwards, lo shma yitzia, is not considered exiting. And therefore, he can't be walking out backwards, it wouldn't qualify as yitzia. Ve'od, and secondly, achori adelis ma'ikal meimar. Backing out of the house isn't going to work in every scenario. What if the tzaras is behind the door? That when he opens up the door to leave, the tzaras backing out backwards won't help because it's behind the door. He can't see it even if he walks backwards. And if you're going to say that, well, he can cut open a window into the house so that even if the tzaras is in a place that's blocked by the door, you would still be able to see it through the window. If that's not, we learn in the Mishnah, Masechta Nigoyim. Bayis awful, a dark house, ain't poschibo chalonos lerosis nigo. That the Mishnah in Masechta Nigoyim says that what if the tzaras is in a very dark house and the kohen is unable to, it's too dark for the kohen to be able to get a proper look to see if it's actually tzaras. So maybe you'll have an idea, okay, why don't we cut a window into the room so that some light can get in and the kohen can see. We say, no, we don't do that. We don't cut windows into the house in order to increase the visibility. Again, Bayis Ofel, a dark house, Ein Poschin Bo Chalonos, we don't cut windows into it, Liris as Nigo, in order to check the tzaras. And therefore, Abai says, backing out of the house, walking backwards out of the house won't help if the tzaras is in a place that is covered by the door when you're walking out. And making a window is not an option because, as the Mishnah says, we don't make windows in order to check tzaras. Amalei Ravit says, Ravit Abaye, I disagree with both of your arguments. When you say, Abaye, that walking out backwards is not considered a yitzia, I'll prove to you otherwise. Kohen Gadol b'Yom HaKippurim yochiach. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur disproves that. Tichsiv by the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, it says Yitzia. Right, it says Ve'yatsa ve'asa esolaso. So it says Yitzia b'tnan, and we learn in the Mishnah in Masechta Yoma that after the Kohen Gadol burns the incense in the Kodesh HaKodashim, how does he leave? He doesn't turn around and turn his back towards the Aron. No. Yatsu v'alu derech knisaso. He would back up and back out and retrace his steps backwards in the same way that he came in. So we see that Yitzia, right, walking backwards, is good enough for the Yitzia of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Therefore, it can be considered Yitzia, argues Rava. With the Ka'amr Bais Ofel in Poskin Lo Bo Chalonis Liros Nigo, and Abayi, when you said that you'd be unable to make a window in order to see any tsaras that might be behind the door. Abayi, when you said that we don't open windows, as the Mishnah says we don't open windows, well, the Mishnah is talking about to determine whether or not there is tsaras. If the house is dark and the kohen can't see whether or not there is tsaras, we don't open up windows in order for the kohen to be able to see. We don't do that. If you could see it, great. If you can't see it, then it's not going to be tsaras. However, argues Rava, in this case where it's already been determined that there is tsaras, there is enough light in the house, the kohen determined that there is tsaras, and now we just want to make sure that as he's walking backwards out of the house, he could still see it. There's no problem about making a window in that case. When you don't yet have a chazakah, when we don't yet know that there is actual tsaras in the house, we're not going to make windows so that we could add light to the room in order to determine. So in that case, we don't do that. Aval, is chazik, but once we've already determined that there is tsaras in the house, so it's been determined. At that point, we can make windows. That's if you want to make a window because you're going to back out of the house, so you can see it as you're backing out to determine that it's still tsaras. That's not a problem. We've already determined that there is tsaras. Now we're just making a window so you can keep an eye on it. But nonetheless, we have a brisa that is unlike Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who suggested that he walks out backwards so you can keep an eye on it, right? To back up for a second, back up. No, but anyways, what are we saying? We're saying, how do we know that we have this concept of that we rely upon a chazakah? We say we know it from the fact that the kohen sees the tsaras, says, okay, it's a proper shear, and then he turns around, leaves the house, and then closes up the house. But how do you know that between the time that he looked at it and the time that he left, maybe the shear shrunk, and it's no longer a shear? We say, well, we assume that just like it was determined that it was a proper shear when the kohen looked at it, we're going to maintain that status. Rav Acha bar Yaakov suggested, wait, maybe there's no assumptions happening over here, maybe he's backing out. Nonetheless, we have a brisa that would go against that would contradict that. Tani Dulok Rav Acha bar Yaakov, we have a brisa that contradicts Rav Acha bar Yaakov. V'yotza hakohen min habayis, that we have a brisa that says that the kohen leaves the house, the tsaras house. Yochel yelech l'soch beiso v'yaskir. Is it possible that it'll walk all the way back to his own house and then close up the tsaras house from his own house? I think Rashi, somebody says either like with a rope or something. He like close the door with the rope, or he has a shaliach do it for him. Talmud Omer el pesach habayis. No, it says that he goes out to the entrance of that house, the tsaras house. Okay, so if it's the entrance to the house, does he literally have to stand in the doorway and close up the house from there? Talmud Omer min habayis says from the house. Min habayis kulo. Now he's got to leave the house and leave the doorway. Okay, so what does he do? Omid b'tzad hamashkov umaskir. It means that he stands next to the doorway and closes up the house from there. How do you know that if he did, however, go back to his house and close up the tsaras house from within his own house? You could change that to besoch amashkov, I think. V'hizgir had closed it from within the doorway, shezgeru muskar, that it works. Tabaloma v'hizgir zabayis mikomakom. Well, it says he closes up the house, whatever, even from his own house it works. No, so what are we saying? From the fact that we're saying that technically speaking, he could even go back to his own house and close up the tzaras house from there. Clearly he can't see the tzaras from his own house. Right? If he's going back to his own house and he can close up the tzaras house from his own house, he can't see this. He can't be looking at. He's not looking at the tzaras at the time that he closes up the house from within his own house. And still, we're saying he can close up the tzaras house from his own house. It must be that he's assuming that it's still the shear because we rely upon the chazakah, that it's still a proper shear. Rav Acha bar Yaakov, however, Rav Acha bar Yaakov will nonetheless answer for you and saying, well, Tigon de Kaime, Dara de Gavre, Bamriki de Koi. Well, you could say he did go back to his house, but all along the way, there's a whole line of people that you have one person standing by the tzaras house with an eye, keeping an eye on the tzaras and saying, okay, it's a proper shear, and he whispers to the next person who says to the next person, who says to the next person, until they report back to him at his house that it's still the proper shear, and they keep on keeping the coin up to date, so that even when he's declaring from his own house that it's tzaras, he does in fact know that it is still tzaras. So again, Rav Acha bar Yaakov maintains that this would not be a good raya to say that we relied upon the chazakah, because either he's still looking at it or he has people reporting to him that it's still a proper shear. But according to the other opinion, this would be a raya to say that no, he turns around, he leaves the house and assumes that it is still the proper shear. Friends, that was Daf Yud, Daf 10 of Masechta Chullin. Wow, Chevra, we went through a lot of amazing and important stuff on Daf Yud of Masechta Chullin. The first part of the daf we discussed when you find that the knife is nicked later on. And so Rav Huna says that the animal is nevela, it's treif, because we have to assume that the knife was already nicked at the time that you sliced through the neck. Rav Chizda says that the animal is kosher. And we said that this was in two different scenarios. One scenario was you were chopping up bones all day long, and Rav Chizda is saying that it was the bone chopping that nicked the knife. Rav Huna says no, we still have to assume that that the knife, that it was cutting through the skin of the neck that nicked the knife, and that the animal is treif. And this would, the same machlokas is also when you slice through the neck and then you hit the bone behind the neck. Rav Huna would say that it's slicing through the skin of the neck, nicked the knife, and and the animal's treif. Rav Chizda would say that after slicing through the neck and you hit the neck bone, that is what made the knife. That is what nicked the knife. But when you slice through the trachea and esophagus, the knife was still intact, and it's a kosher shchita. And the Gemara says that we hold like Rav Huna in the latter case. We hold like Rav Huna that when you were not chopping up bones all day, but that you simply slice through the neck, and then and you hit the bone behind it, and then you see that the knife is nicked, we'll say like Rav Huna, because there's no reason to assume that it was nicked by the neck bone any more than it was nicked by the skin of the neck. Right? The slicing to the neck bone is not like chopping up bones all day. The likelihood of the neck bone is nicking the knife is equal to the skin nicking the knife, and in that case we will hold like Rav Huna and say that the animal is a treifa. And when it comes to chopping up bones all day, there we'll paskin like Rav Chizda and say that it's the bones that nick the knife and that the animal is kosher. We also mentioned that you have to, therefore, although I don't know if this is halacha, but we saw the opinion of Kana that you should check the knife between each shchita. Then we got to the question of the source for relying upon a chazakah, and we want to say that comes from tzaras of the house. That a kohen goes into the house, determines that there's a proper shear of tzaras, turns around to leave the house, still assuming that shear is still intact. Rav Acha bar Yaakov disagrees, however, and he says, no, you back out of the house, keeping an eye on it, no assumptions being made, and even if he goes back to his house to close up, to clear the tzaras and close up the house, it would only be if there's like a whole line of people that are keeping him up to date and reporting back to him that there's still a proper shear, but the tzaras would not be a riot the proof for relying upon a chazakah, according to Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Friends, that was Daf 10 of Masechta Chulin. I hope you enjoyed. Catch ya later.